The mixing tip that I'm going to be showing you today is one that completely changed my mixes for the better. When I first started mixing, I used to have trouble getting things to sound clear, getting some clarity in the mix, and preventing things from sounding muddy. But once I started using this technique, that all changed. Hey everyone, Joe here. In this video, I'm going to be showing you how to avoid muddy mixes using high-pass filters. Firstly, I'm going to go over what they are, then we're going to talk about why you should be using them, and finally, we'll be going into a mix and I'll show you how to use them and you'll be able to hear the difference that they make. So a high-pass filter is a EQ filter that cuts off frequencies below a certain set frequency. You could also call it a low-cut filter. So you can set the frequency where you want to start cutting below, and you can also set how steep the cutoff is. So whether you want basically everything cut off below that certain frequency, say everything below 100 Hertz, for example, or if you want a more of a shallow slope that gradually cuts off more as the frequencies get lower. But why would I want to cut out all the low end, I hear you ask? Well, we normally wouldn't want to cut out all the low end, but on pretty much every track, you're going to want to cut out at least some. Below around 80 Hertz in the frequency spectrum is where you'll find the low bass and the sub bass. Now for kick and bass instruments, this is where most of that bass energy is going to be coming from. But for most of the other instruments, there's not really going to be an awful lot of value to your mix below around sort of 80 to 100 Hertz. Your bass instruments really need that section of the frequency spectrum to stand out for themselves. And if you don't cut any of the low bass or sub bass out of any of the other tracks, it's going to be hard to get things to stand out. You're also going to be getting a lot of bass energy coming from all the different tracks, so the guitars, synths, vocals, and it's going to start to make things sound muddy the more tracks you add. I'm not saying get fixated on a certain frequency like 80 Hertz I mentioned. It's really going to depend on how things are recorded. Something like toms, I'd probably only be cutting below around 40-50 Hertz because I do want some of that low end in there, and then around maybe 80 Hertz or so for vocals. But again, it depends on how it's recorded. Some tracks might not even need a high pass filter, but for the majority of them, you're going to need one to some degree. Now let's take a look at a session. I'll show you how to use a high pass filter and you'll hear the difference that they make. So here we are inside a mix session. What I've done is I've put my high pass filter for each track that has one on a separate plugin, just so you can see exactly what I've done. Let's take a look at the overhead recording for a second. We've got a high pass filter and we've got two main parameters. We've got the frequency, that's going to be where you're cutting off below, and the Q or slope, you might see it written as on your plugin, which changes how steep the cutoff is. So 24 dB per octave, that's pretty much going to chop it right off once you get to that frequency. But then we're going a little bit smoother with a 12 or 18 dB per octave. So let's just dial that high pass filter in on the overhead and see exactly what it's doing. Bring it back to 20 Hertz. So as you can see, the higher up we go, the less bass we're getting. So you got the kick around this mark, it's starting to disappear, and then the snare, and then right at the top, you've still got the hi-hats and the cymbals. So for example, if you only wanted the cymbals and hi-hats on your overhead mic, you could just chop off quite a lot of the low end with a high pass filter, but we don't want to cut everything out. But I definitely do want to be cutting out some on the overhead because we've got two kick mics, really nice recording for the kick and the snare, and I want most of that coming from the kick and the snare. So if I add those two back in and dial in that high pass filter on the overheads, obviously we're still getting a really powerful snare and kick drum response, but it's not coming from the overheads, so it's sounding a little bit tighter and more focused where we've mixed the kick and snare separately. But then even on the instruments like the kick and the bass, I have cut out a tiny bit of the sub bass just at around 30 hertz. Because again, it's just not needed. It's just rumble, pretty much inaudible. It's just extra energy that we don't need in there. Most of that bass response that we want from the kick is between around sort of 40 to 80 hertz. Now, individually, these high pass filters don't make a huge audible difference, but it's when we've got everything in at once where you can really start to hear the difference, and when you can hear that muddiness sort of disappear. I'm gonna play it with all of these high pass filters off and then bring them in, and just really, you might have to listen to it a couple of times, just really listen to each instrument, how they all just gain that little bit of clarity.
Can you see me? Are you there? Can you hear me? 'Cause I'm mine, locked in a cage. Oh, nothing, I don't feel rage. No, no, I wanna, but I know I'll try up. So if I fall, could you pick me up? 'Cause I'm a brain.
It's not an enormous difference, but you can definitely hear more clarity there. The guitars, where I've cut off some of the low end on the rhythm guitars, it's not fighting so hard with that bass. There's a lot more sort of distinction between the two instruments, and then it makes a fair amount of difference on the drums as well. Let's just hear the drums, the difference between. Yeah, so it's almost bringing a little bit more out of the cymbals and just tightening up that low end, getting a bit more clarity with the kick as well. So high pass filters, it's something that you really don't want to be forgetting about. It's something that you want to be using right from the beginning when you first start learning how to mix. Again, I wasn't taught this when I first started mixing, and I was having real trouble with my low end, getting things to sound clear, reducing that mud. And when I started using high pass filters, things started to get a lot less muddy. So let me know in the comments section below, do you use high pass filters? Will you be using them now after this video? And for more mixing tips and tutorials, just hit that subscribe button. And as always, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.